Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the 22nd chapter of Inheritance, written by A is for Amy 71 on AO3. There has been a shake-up in the pairings for battle training. Let's find out the outcome after the trigger warnings. This fanfiction is for mature audiences with canon-typical violence and a trigger warning for major character death. If that isn't your style, then I recommend Shades of Green, which is written by Maybe It's Friendly on AO3. It can be found on my channel. Canon Divergence is the name of the game and indulges the what-ifs of Midoriya Izuku having a quirk. With that being said, the chapter summary is as followed. Izuku and Todoroki face off against Kachan and Yaoyorozu. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 22. Izuku took a moment to thank the gods that he didn't have to try to cooperate with Kachan for their first assignment. A moment was all he got, though. Now for your objectives! Inside that building is a missile. For our purposes, it's obviously not a real one. The villain's job is to guard the missile from the heroes. The hero's job is to acquire the missile. That's it, easy, right? The villains will have 10 minutes to place the missile anywhere inside the building they wish to defend it from. Then the heroes will be sent in and the test begins. All the heroes have to do is touch the missile to acquire it, and all the villains have to do is prevent that from happening. How you accomplish either goal is up to you. You'll each be given a roll of capture tape that will act as handcuffs for this mission, and once you are bound with it, you are out for the duration. The scenario will end as soon as the hero team touches the missile, gets captured, or the 15-minute timer runs out. All four of them nodded their heads in understanding, and Kachan and Yaoyorozu were given the signal to go inside the building. A timer was started, and Izuku turned to Todoroki, remembering how prickly the other boy had been at the recommendation exam. Today, Todoroki was dressed in completely white, with the left side of his body completely encased in ice like some kind of snowman. Izuku didn't comment on how silly he thought the look was, and instead focused on making a plan to defeat the villains. Where do you think they'll hide the missile? Izuku asked him quietly in case one of the villains was listening somehow. I'd put it close to the top floor, Todoroki said with a shrug. But that won't matter when I freeze all the walls and floors. They'll be stuck in place and... Izuku was already shaking his head. That won't work. Izuku realized how unhelpful that sounded when Todoroki scowled at him and softened his remark. Kachan, Bakugo, can make explosions with his hands, so ice won't stop him. It might slow him down, though, and make him give away their position with the noise, Izuku said, pinching his bottom lip as he considered it. And Yaoyorozu could make almost anything with her creation quirk, so we can't bet on her being trapped by the ice either. So what do you suggest? Todoroki asked, sounding surly. Izuku gave it some thought and ran his idea past Todoroki to see what he thought. I can handle my part of that, Todoroki said after hearing the plan, sounding as though he doubted Izuku could handle his. I know you can. I've seen you in action, Izuku placated. He couldn't afford to screw up his first hero class assignment, and if that meant coddling someone with a prickly temperament, it wasn't like he hadn't had practice at that. You're sure you can handle yours? That guy seems to really hate you, Todoroki pointed out. Yes, Izuku said, not willing to entertain the idea of failure. We can win this, but don't underestimate them. They're both crazy strong. Izuku was surprised and pleased that Todoroki wasn't being too resistant to working with him. He thought at first that he would shut Izuku out in his attempt to just strong-arm it with ice. Since Izuku wasn't completely sure how strong his ice quirk really was, it was safer to have a plan. He'd been impressed by what he had seen at the recommendation exam, but it was different in battle. Hero team! Start your search for the missile! All Might's voice said through the earpieces they'd been given. Izuku and Todoroki nodded at each other and went in through the front door. Only Todoroki's quick reflexes kept them from being smacked by a volley of pellets that broke against the wall of ice that flew up in front of them. The pellets created a bright flash that burned itself out after a few seconds, but it would have blinded them for far longer if the ice hadn't provided a shield. They appeared to have been launched by a small catapult, triggered by a tripwire. "You'll need to keep an eye out for more booby traps," Izuku told his partner as they proceeded much more cautiously. The pellets were probably the work of Yaoyorozu, intended to slow them down. It was pretty ingenious, and Izuku would have fallen for it if not for his partner. He mentally berated himself for not taking this danger into account, but knew they still had their best chance with the plan they had set in place. Todoroki headed for the stairs, which was very much like the ones in Izuku's apartment building. Up one flight, then a sharp turn in the other direction, making something of a closed spiral. Every other landing would have an entrance or a hallway up to the next floor. Izuku was relatively sure that Karchan would never pass up an opportunity to engage in battle with him, where he could try to beat up Izuku without any consequence for it. If his guess was right, Karchan would leave Yaoyorozu to guard the missile while he went on the offensive, looking for a fight on the lower floors. In fact, he was probably lying in wait, hoping Izuku would walk right into his waiting trap. Instead, Izuku quickly looked around his surroundings and started to initiate his plan. He tapped the various parts of his suit to make them the color of the ceiling, then engaged his levitation quirk so he floated to the spot he wanted. From his new vantage point, he could see a couple of tripwires in the hallway, leading in both directions off of the front entrance. He crawled along the ceiling to a shadowy spot, and listened intently to the sounds of the building. He heard some noises from above, and figured Todoroki was encountering some booby traps as well. "You okay?" he asked into his microphone, in the quietest voice he could. "Fine," was Todoroki's quiet answer, though his voice was a little breathless. "I'm on the top floor, and I'll work my way down each floor from here." "Understood," Izuku replied. He hoped that Todoroki would call for help if he needed it, and waited for Karchan to make his move. He didn't want to wait for too long, and took his small first aid kit from a pouch at his hip and tossed it, hitting one of the tripwires to set off a barrage of what looked like globs of glue being flung from further down the hall. It was impressive that all of this had been set up in only 10 minutes, and wondered how many there were throughout the building. The trap made a loud enough noise that it would alert anyone nearby of someone on the first floor. It was only seconds before he heard stealthy footsteps coming down the stairs. He waited until he saw a shadow on the floor from the stairwell before he held his breath, further camouflaging himself with transparency. Karchan came into the area near the door and furtively checked left and right as he stalked around the small wall of ice, making sure no one was hiding behind it. He went to investigate the tripped wire, and just as Izuku hoped, that put Karchan directly under him for a moment. When Karchan bent over to examine the trap to see if it had misfired, Izuku dropped onto his back from above and managed to get a hold of one of his arms. He almost had the capture tape on one wrist, but Karchan was fast, and Izuku just barely avoided a blast to the face with an extreme backward flex. A backward handspring had Izuku out of range in a matter of seconds, and he stood facing Karchan, who looked furious. Izuku didn't wait for him to initiate an attack, and used his speed to get in close. He grabbed the front of Karchan's costume and pulled him forward, kicking one of his legs off balance by hooking it with his own, then thrust him backward. Izuku was apparently not the only one who had been training in fighting techniques, though. Karchan rolled with the throw and popped to his feet, and Izuku ended up taking a fist to the jaw for underestimating his opponent's speed and tracking ability. His teeth clacked together on the impact, but luckily he didn't bite his cheek or tongue. They circled each other slowly in the tight space, feinting and dodging at each other while they each calculated their next move. "I've been waiting for this day," Karchan told Izuku with a feral smile. "I've always wanted to smack that smug look off your face, always looking down on me." Izuku had heard that line before. There was no use in arguing with him about it. You can try, but it's not going to be that easy, Izuku warned him. Karchan charged at him, using his explosions to propel him forward until it was like he was in flight, but Izuku was ready for him. He swiveled on his heel and used Karchan's momentum against him, waiting until he was almost past to grab his leg and swing him around in a sideways arc. Karchan slammed into the wall of ice that Todoroki had made earlier. The ice broke in large chunks as the impact cracked it, and Karchan jumped to his feet, even more livid than before. "I'm going to fucking destroy you," he snarled, launching at Izuku again. This time, Izuku launched himself lightly into the air with levitation, and then dropped to the ground once the threat had passed beneath him. Karchan's control was impressive as he twisted in the air and used a controlled explosion to turn in the direction he just passed through. This time, Izuku took hold of the large grenade covering Karchan's forearm and with a pivot, threw him over his shoulder to slam him onto his back onto the ground. Karchan was winded by the impact, and Izuku was quick to wrap the capture tape around one wrist and then around the grenade over his other forearm. "Bakugo has been captured!" All Might's voice sounded in their ears. "He is out for the rest of the battle." "I'll come back up to you," Izuku said to Todoroki, turning toward the stairs and becoming aware of scuffling noises over his ear mic. His foot was on the first step when he was blasted by an explosion from behind. He turned transparent for a moment as the air was forced from his lungs, but his new costume kept the heat at bay, and it didn't seem to tear either. His head snapped forward and his balance kicked in just in time to keep him from smashing face first into the stairs. He could hear All Might's voice in his earpiece. "Bakugo, stand down! You've been eliminated from this exercise!" Izuku foolishly expected him to obey and let his guard down, taking a punch to the kidney that had him taking a step forward. "No villain in their right mind would just stay wherever they were put without trying to escape," Karchan shouted angrily. "He never should have turned his back on me." All Might was still ordering him to stop when Karchan held up his left arm and began to pull the pin near his elbow with his right hand. "This thing's been storing my sweat since..." He never got to finish. Izuku couldn't believe the dumbass was going to monologue at a time like this, but he wasn't going to pass up the opportunity it provided. Before Karchan could register what was happening, Izuku was in his personal space, out of range of the blast. The bulk of the grenade gauntlets meant that bending his arm fully would be difficult for Karchan, especially with Izuku up close. Angry that it had come to this, he drew back his fist and jabbed the escaped villain in the throat, just like Gran had taught him. He knew it was a dirty move, but he also remembered Gran telling you that there were no moves too dirty in a fight for your life, and those explosions could be deadly. Izuku quickly sidestepped out of the way as the other boy dropped to his knees. Before Izuku could react further, there was a tremendous blast as the pin left the grenade that had been hooked on Karchan's finger when he'd reached for his abused throat. Several things happened at once. "Hero Team wins!" All Might shouted, barely audible over the thunder of the explosion and the ringing in Izuku's ears. It didn't even register that the exercise was over as Karchan began to scream. The blonde's arm was forced backward at an awkward angle by the explosion, and being unbalanced sent him flying backward, spinning him and propelling him several feet, where he hit the wall head first. From there he fell to the floor face down, limp and unconscious. Izuku hurried over to check Karchan's pulse and found it in his carteroid with a sigh of relief. "Don't move him, Midoriya," All Might ordered through the earpiece. "Help is on the way." Izuku quickly moved further away from Karchan. "What happened here?" Yaoyorozu exclaimed as she and Todoroki came rushing down the stairs and saw what a wreck the front entrance was. Izuku barely had time to notice that Todoroki had swelling over his good eye. Both eyes were red and watery. The ice that had encrusted him earlier was gone. Part of the wall was rubble, and patches of sunlight were coming through the hole that the explosion had caused. The front door burst open at that point, and All Might, Aizawa, and a couple of Medibots filed in and began to assess their injured charge.
Midoriya, you should go to Recovery Girl too,
Yaoyorozu told him while he watched them load Karchan onto a stretcher. Me? Why? Izuku asked in bewilderment. Karchan wouldn't want me there.
Your face is bleeding, and you look like you have some burns, she said. You can't feel that.
Izuku took a moment to take stock of how he felt. There was some stinging to his face and the back of his neck, and he'd taken a couple of solid punches, but mostly his adrenaline was keeping the worst of it at bay. Maybe? Mostly my ears hurt and everything sounds muffled. The Medibots moved quickly to carry Karchan's prone figure out of the building for transport to the nurse's office. I think Recovery Girl's going to have her hands full for a while, Izuku said, watching them go. They walked out after the bots were clear, and stood in the street in front of the ruined building, unsure of where to go from there. Izuku sincerely doubted that Karchan would want to see him when he woke up. The building itself was in bad shape and there were icicles hanging from all the windows on the 4th floor. Midoriya, Aizawa said, coming to stand in front of him. Do you feel like you need immediate medical attention? Not really, he said with a shrug. I think Karchan's injuries are more important. Aizawa just stared at him consideringly for a moment before checking his eyes and doing a quick assessment. Then he nodded. You can stay and watch the other team-ups for now, but if you start to feel too uncomfortable or show signs of a concussion, you're going immediately. Yes, Sensei, Izuku agreed. Aizawa looked as though he was going to accompany Karchan back to the school, so the three of them remaining followed All Might to a building across the street, where there were monitors set up showing every room in the building they'd just been in. Izuku looked at the monitor that showed the mock missile, and raised an eyebrow. Almost the entire room was encased in ice, except for a spot near the missile. There, a melted, slushy spot where the ice had been melted, told Izuku what had happened. He looked at Yaoyorozu, whom he had been avoiding really looking at because her costume was so revealing, and saw that her skin was red and covered in goosebumps and her costume was wet. Oddly, her hair looked normal, though her lips were tinged blue. Todoroki must have cocooned her in ice from neck to feet. Wow, are you okay?
A bit cold, but otherwise fine, she said with a small smile. Thank you for asking.
All Might took off his enormous jacket and draped it across Yaoyorozu's shoulders as he passed to go to the control board and the bank of monitors. Sero, who emitted tape from his elbows, and Sato, who gained strength by eating sugar, were the villains for the next exercise, and Jiro, her earlobes could plug into almost anything and allow her to hear things from afar, and Kaminari, electricity quirk, were the heroes. They would be using a different building, and All Might pressed a few buttons to activate the cameras for the new location. He spoke into a microphone telling the villain team to enter the building and prepare. Sato and Sero went inside, and Jiro and Kaminari turned to each other to strategize. At least, Izuku assumed they were strategizing. There was no sound.
Midoriya, that was insane,
Mineta exclaimed. They had 10 minutes to kill while they waited for the true exercise to begin, so many of the students gathered around Izuku, Yaoyorozu, and Todoroki to talk about their recent experience.
Todoroki, the way you froze that whole room was crazy. How did you do it?
Kirishima said excitedly. I stomped my foot, Todoroki answered, completely straight-faced. Izuku wondered if Todoroki was more blunt than intentionally rude. He didn't really show much expression in his face when he spoke or even when using his quirk. He might have even been joking, but didn't know how to deliver it. Yaoyorozu! The anti-freeze you tossed to Todoroki was genius, and those booby traps were very clever, Ida said admiringly. As expected of a recommended student. She blushed a bit at the praise, but she definitely deserved it in Izuku's opinion. He bet he could learn a lot from her in the future. Booby traps, Mineta said jokingly. Get it? 'Cause she's got giant Everyone just looked at him like he was crap on their shoes, and then there was a loud slapping sound before Mineta yelped in pain. Izuku assumed that Hagakure, being invisible, had done what the rest of them had wanted to, and slapped the boy for being perverted and disrespectful. "I hope Karchan is okay," Izuku fretted as everyone pretended they didn't know Mineta had been slapped. "That hit was pretty bad." "Why do you call him Karchan?" Ashido asked, high-fiving Hagakure by the sound of it. Izuku had noticed that the girl with pink hair and skin had a very bubbly and extroverted personality. Her questions seemed born of curiosity instead of teasing or anything like that. Well, we went to preschool and kindergarten together for a while. Then middle school too. It was kind of a habit for a while, and now I just do it to annoy him, because he calls me Deku to annoy me." Most of them chuckled at that.
"Why is he so angry all the time?"
Hagakure wanted to know. Izuku could only guess at the intent behind her question, since he couldn't see her face, but he simply shrugged. He's always been that way. Maybe it's part of his quirk, an explosive temper to go with explosive hands. Maybe being pissed all the time makes his hands sweat more. "I must say it was very unsporting of him to attack you when your back was turned, especially since he had been eliminated from the exercise," Ida said haughtily. "Pretty unmanly," Kirishima agreed. "I wonder if he'll get in trouble." Izuku didn't know the answer to that. I mean, he wasn't wrong that in a real-life situation a villain wouldn't just be cuffed and left alone, Izuku said. He probably thought he was exploiting a loophole. "But at the same time," Ojiro said, his tail swishing slowly back and forth behind him, "he was told the rules ahead of time, and his attacks seemed very personal, by at least the expressions he was making, or maybe he's just a good actor." "We have a complicated history," Izuku said with a sigh. "Hero team may enter the building!" All Might told Jiro and Kaminari through the microphone. Everyone's attention was pulled toward the monitors at that point, and Izuku was saved from having to explain further. Because the battles ran past their allotted time, it was decided that the remaining two groups would continue the following day. Then they would go over the results and discuss everyone's performances as a class. Those that had already participated had been assigned homework to write up a short report on their own observations about the team they were assigned to, and what went wrong and right during the exercise. After class, Izuku was sent for medical attention, and by that time he was glad to go. The burns had truly begun to sting, and the areas where he'd taken hits were sore. He stopped to change back into his uniform and found his way to Recovery Girl's office.
"I was told you might be stopping by," she said when she spotted Izuku. "It's not a good sign for you to be in my office twice in 2 days.
Izuku ducked his head sheepishly and gave a wry grin. "Sorry." She tutted at him and told him to sit down on one of the 6 beds along the walls of the room. One bed had the curtains drawn around it, and he wondered if Karchan was in there. He hadn't come back to class.
"Bakugo just left a few minutes ago," she said, following his gaze.
"Is he okay?" Izuku asked. "That hit to the head was pretty bad."
"I healed him completely,"
she assured him, motioning for him to take off his jacket and shirt.
"The worst was the dislocated shoulder and all that torn tissue."
Izuku winced, remembering how his arm had been forced backward by the blast of the gauntlet.
"You should have come to me sooner,"
she scolded as she looked at his back.
"These bruises."
"Bruises?" Izuku asked, trying to turn his head enough to look at what she was talking about. "There you are, young man," All Might said, entering the room in his diminished form. "Aizawa had said you'd come to see..." Ouch! That last part was a sympathetic sound as he looked at Izuku's bare back. I can't see it, but it doesn't hurt too badly, Izuku said. All Might took out his phone and snapped a picture, then showed it to Izuku. It was hard to believe he was looking at his own back. The center between his shoulder blades was nearly black where he'd taken the brunt of the explosion, and it radiated out from there, getting gradually lighter in tone. There was another, more reddish bruise over his left kidney, where he'd been punched. His neck and ears looked like he'd had a bad sunburn, and some of his hair was singed. "My suit was amazing!" Izuku marveled. "It took a direct hit, and it didn't even take damage."
"You should be more worried about your body than your suit," Recovery Girl scolded. "And you! I know you transferred your power to him, but that doesn't make him invincible."
All Might quickly whipped his head around to make sure they were alone. "Could you keep it down?" he begged. "Anyone who heard you could—"
"I'm not stupid!" she snapped at him. "Give me some credit. You need to be more responsible for your students' safety. That Bakugo boy could have snapped his neck."
Both Izuku and All Might bowed their heads in contrition at her steely gaze. "Sorry," All Might said, cowed. "Sorry," Izuku parroted. Technically, it was Karchan's own fault he'd flown into a wall, but that didn't change the fact that he'd been injured on All Might's first day as a teacher. Recovery Girl nodded in satisfaction at that, and continued to examine Izuku to make sure he had enough stamina to be healed right away. Izuku was grateful when she placed a kiss on his cheek and felt the stinging of the burns fade. Tight muscles that he hadn't realized had been tense loosened, and the ringing in his ears cleared up. He immediately felt tired, and knew he would likely fall asleep almost as soon as he got home.
"The bruising will mostly fade, but you may still feel tender until tomorrow while your body finishes healing up," she told him as she handed him a couple of wrapped candies and patted his hand. "Go ahead and get dressed, then you can go home."
Speaking of home, All Might, I forgot to ask what the arrangement was for me to go home. Should I call a cab or something? "I'll be driving you," All Might assured. "I have a car in the faculty parking lot, and no one will recognize me in this form. If any of your classmates see you, you can just say I'm a family friend or something." Izuku nodded, feeling bad that so many people were going out of their way to protect him, when he was sure there were a lot of other things they probably wanted to do. He followed All Might to a minivan that was pretty nondescript. "I would have thought you had a sports car or something," Izuku commented, climbing into the passenger seat. "I have one that I take out occasionally, but this one was available from the agency and doesn't attract any attention," All Might explained. Izuku nodded and settled back into his seat with a stifled yawn. "Today was really interesting. I was so surprised when you showed up in the classroom that I almost freaked out." "I wanted it to be a surprise," All Might said with a grin, "though I'm sorry that you got paired against Bakugo. I shouldn't have let that happen, knowing the past you two share." Izuku hadn't even thought about blaming anyone for that. "It was bound to happen sooner than later," Izuku said philosophically. "Just as well to get it out of the way. I purposely didn't tell him that I got into UA and let him believe I wasn't going to attend a hero school. He's probably thinking I was trying to make a fool of him." "Were you?" All Might asked curiously. Maybe a little," Izuku answered around another yawn. "I knew it would be a shock for him, and not a pleasant one." "Then why did you do it?" All Might asked, sounding interested in the answer. "Mostly because I didn't want to deal with it until I had to," Izuku admitted. "If he had found out before, the last weeks of middle school would have been a nightmare, and I had finals to deal with. I put it off to save myself the grief and the trouble of his tantrums for a bit longer." "That's fair, I suppose," All Might allowed. "I was afraid you had deliberately baited him for the satisfaction of seeing you upset." "No, It's more just being tired of him always turning everything I say and do into a personal attack on him. Don't get me wrong. It's satisfying to prove him wrong. But that wasn't why I kept it a secret. Izuku's eyelids were beginning to droop as All Might pulled up to his apartment building. Rapid Fire was waiting just inside the door of the lobby and nodded to let them know that he had seen their arrival. "You did well today," All Might told him as Izuku reached for the door handle. "I'm proud of you." Izuku smiled, feeling a warm sense of pride at the praise. "Thanks, All Might. You did good today too." Izuku walked into the building and nodded at Rapid Fire, who fell into step with him, but instead of the stairwell, Izuku headed for the bank of elevators. "Rough day?" the sidekick asked as they ascended to the 15th floor. "Yeah, but it was really cool," Izuku said with a sleepy smile. Once Rapid Fire had checked the apartment and left again, Izuku face-planted onto the couch and didn't stir again until his father came home a few hours later. He stayed up late, fixing a quick meal for them both, while he told his dad about his second day of school, then spent some time doing homework. He went to sleep just before midnight and looked forward to what the rest of the week would bring. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. You know when people shout at the TV when they don't like what's happening to a character in a show? That was me whilst recording this chapter. As much as I hate to say it, Bakugo got some major comeuppance. A little life update. I have dyed my hair and it feels so me to have a bright hair colour again. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction. A is for Amy71 on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!